Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate all types of creativity, and my mission in life is to find interesting people, talk to them, and find out what makes them tick. So it's extraordinary excitement and pleasure that I welcome Karen Eber to today's podcast, and you'll see why in a second when I read her bio. Karen is a TED speaker, award-winning author of The Perfect Story, which I can see right over her back, a former Fortune 500 executive who has educated and inspired more than 3 million people globally. She helps people harness the science and skill of storytelling to better inform, influence, and inspire people in business and in life. So here we are. We love story, and we're talking to a story expert. Karen, it's wonderful to have you here, and thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. Here's to all things story.
Here's to all things story. And it's funny, right? Because of course, in my personal, professional life, I'm obsessed with the intersection of story and its many manifestations. But I'm trying to think of a time when I've talked to someone I would call a storytelling expert. So in that alone, I think this is a little bit novel and a little bit refreshing because we tend to get into the craft, which of course is so critical. But you, and I think what we're going to talk about today is really taking a step back and talking about story with a capital S, which means we're talking about the impulse that connects the first cave drawings to TikTok and everything in between. But I think the best way for you to talk about what you do is rather than me read your impressive list of bona fides, talk a little bit about your relationship to story and how one becomes an expert in this lifelong kind of craft and pursuit.
I became an expert kicking and screaming. I don't think I ever set out to be one. I told my first story at a really young age. So I have two different color eyes, a brown eye and a green eye. And when you have a physical trait that is noticeable, which is depending on the light, noticeable, might not be at the moment, um, people will ask you a lot of questions, right? Whenever you're different in some way, you get a lot of questions. And that's what happened. I would notice the moment when people would notice my eyes, would be in conversation and their words would slow. And I could see their eyes going back and forth between mine, almost like their brain was trying to decide, like, do I look at the brown one or the green one, or the brown one or the green one? And I would brace myself because the same thing happened every time. Someone would stop and go, did you know you have two different color eyes? Which that alone is just so funny to me. Sometimes I couldn't resist. I'd be like, no, but we would have a script that would play out every single time the same way. And the next response would be, I know a dog. I know a dog that has two different color eyes. To which I always was like, okay, what do you say to that? But it didn't
Right.
matter because there's this whole monologue that's going to happen. Because the next thing was always David Bowie. David Bowie had two different color eyes. He actually didn't. He had a pupil that was permanently dilated because he had an accident, which made his eyes look different. But it doesn't matter. It wasn't about that. Because now
Right.
we're into the questioning portion, which is like, what color eyes do your parents have? And do you see the same color out of each eye? To which I'm always like, what do you see out of your eyes? And so this thing that I always loved about myself became this really awkward experience because I
Yeah.
now was a sideshow act in a circus and people are calling friends over. And it felt like a burden. It was awkward. So I made this vow to myself, like, next time this happens, I'm going to tell a story. And so sure enough, I get the, how did that happen? And I told them that I'd been born with brown eyes. I was in my room coloring one night, and you know how we all had that big box of crayons that you throw them all into, and some of them are perfect, but some of them are broken and peeled. I reached into that box and I pulled out a green crayon and I smelled it, and it didn't really smell like anything. But I took a bite and I was amazed that I liked the texture and it tasted pretty good. So I ate it and I reached into the box and pulled out another and another until all the green crayons in the box were gone. And the next day I woke up and my eye was green. And then I would be quiet and people would just be looking at me like, what? Like logic tells me there's no way your eyes change colors because you ate crayons, but you were a little convincing, and I would let them off the hook. But this shift happened in that moment where I went from feeling on display and different and odd to us having a genuine connection because they would laugh and they would realize they actually asked me if I saw the same colors out of each eye. And we would have an experience and connection that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I started to realize very early on that stories don't just entertain, they can create connection and even shift energy in the most artificial of circumstances. And so that began my journey of leaning into stories in different moments throughout my careers. I worked in companies like General Electric and Deloitte as head of leadership development and a head of culture. I use stories to create different connections and share understanding.
So that's amazing. And you had me going, all right? I mean, you had me going for a second with the crayon story, but
Yeah.
I definitely want to dive into the skill thing, but I will say I'm really glad you mentioned, and I'd love you to talk more if you want about the corporate side, because whether I'm kind of doing my own thing or certainly when I'm talking to students or maybe younger audiences, one of the first things I try to impress upon them is this idea that everything is story. You can get too cute by half, but I explain that everything that you buy or is sold is a process of story. So whether we're talking about a political campaign and who you're going to vote for, what sneaker you buy, what beer you drink, these are all stories. I still think culturally it's very underappreciated and understood how much storytelling is integral to how corporate America works, and in good and bad ways. But maybe talk a little bit about how you used story, or did you find barriers to getting stories understood, or is it something that maybe a lot of us we know it, we just don't know how to define it? Like stories happening all the time, but when does that moment occur, like in a corporate environment, when people get like, ah, this is story happening?
All the time. So I used it when I was in General Electric. I was heading up culture in a business of 90,000 employees in 150 countries. And the goal of organizational culture is how are you creating leaders and teams in an environment where people can thrive and deliver business outcomes? And to do that, you've got to lay out like, here's what we want, here's what's desired, here's what's encouraged. And each person has to think about what does this mean for me and what do I want to do? That that intentional pausing and reflection and setting intentions um, requires individual connection. And there was no way for me to sit with everyone individually or even get them into a classroom. And so I found that through stories, I could tell stories about what great leaders did or what great teams did. And I often used stories from my life and connected the idea from it to the takeaway message. And what I learned is that it didn't matter where people lived in the world. It didn't matter their gender. It didn't matter the age they were. The stories connected, even in those stories where they had never had that experience. And so stories create this way to build an understanding in someone's mind and form a emotional imprint that is used that in our decision making that can make a difference. And so everything is story. The reason why TikTok is so successful with all of these influencers that are showing you the get ready with me and the whatever, you're living someone's story and you are influenced to buy a product or read a book or podcast or whatever they're talking about because you see someone's experience of it. When you have this ability, you are able to build understandings in people's minds and get your communications to have a further tail.
Yeah, and I think, to me, there's just wonderful tension between how story can unite and individualize. And it's constantly this push and pull of everyone has their own unique story, but stories remind us how much we are alike ultimately. And I think, good storytellers both understand and take advantage of that, which is why, certain works we talk about resonate through time. if they're familiar, if they're told in a way that both underscore the similarities but have enough distinctness, there's that beautiful tension, which I think maybe is getting into the science. I would love you to talk a little bit about maybe just from a highest level, if I were to say, so what is the science of storytelling? I know you've already kind of been talking about it, but I seldom hear those two words combined, and it's intoxicating to me because it is a science and there is so much to unpack. But yeah, talk a little bit about what science and storytelling means.
There's so many different things that are happening, but if we look at how we make decisions, that's a really helpful place to think about stories. Because if you think of like, let's say I put up an ink blot and I ask you, what is it? What do you think this is? And we ask all the listeners, we're going to get so many different answers. And the reason is that as we experience things, as we have experiences through our senses and we take in information, they get stamped with emotional data. So think of it this way. If you take a photo on your phone and you swipe up, stamped on that photo is the date, the location, the f-stop, like every piece of metadata you need to recreate that photo. You didn't do anything to add it to the photo, you just took the photo, but it's immediately stored there. Something similar happens as you're taking information through your senses, as you're having experiences, they get stamped with emotional metadata, and that gets stored in your long-term memory. So when you put up that ink blot and your brain immediately is like, what is this? Is this something we know? Is this related to something we know? Is it brand new? It's scanning your long-term memory, the files of your emotional metadata. What scientists have found is that um, people who are unable to experience emotions. There's a neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, who studied patients that had damage in the frontal lobe of their brain. So these people were fully functioning, had jobs and relationships and could walk, talk, eat, all that they looked and acted completely normal. But because of where the damage was in their brain, they could not experience emotions. And because of that, they could not make decisions. Something as simple as, am I going to sort my computer files by name or date, would leave them stuck because emotions are at the decision, at the heart of the decisions that we make. And what Damasio found is that all of this is happening subconsciously. So when we're trying to make decisions, our brain is making these predictions. It's trying to say, make these decisions based on what we should do, based on our long-term memory of these experiences stamped with emotional metadata. So what stories do is this really cool experience, this almost artificial reality of you can experience a story that gets stamped with that emotional metadata and stored in your long-term memory. And it may be something you've never done before in your life, but when you're encountering something similar to it, it's going to inform your decision making. Your brain's going to say, wait, we've heard something about this before, so let's try this. Stories can create that virtual reality, allowing you to feel like you're actually there in the story and have it become a part of your decision-making process, which is amazing. But even listening to a story, you start to feel empathy towards the person telling the story. So think about when you've had the chance to maybe grab coffee with someone you don't know well, and you're exchanging your paths to that moment, your professional histories and stuff, and you come away feeling bonded and closer. It's because of this, where when you experience empathy towards someone telling a story, it creates this release of oxytocin. It's the feel-good neurochemical, and it creates this moment of bonding or connection that you cannot fake and you cannot will. And so, by someone telling a good story, creating that increase in empathy and the release of oxytocin, you actually create this neurochemical shift in the body. And the brain says, this person feels safe to be around. So, a great story can not only influence your decision making, it can make you feel more trustworthy, it can make you feel more open or comfortable around people. It is such a fascinating way for us to have experiences that we've never had and to be open to forming bonds and connections that we may not have had otherwise.
What I mean, I'm when you talked about the decision-making process being influenced by emotions, that just it first of all is mind-blowing. It makes so much sense on an intuitive level, and it also just completely um, explodes the myth that decision making can and should be like this rational process. I think it just shows it to me is something very beautiful, how much goes on inside that we're not aware of.
Yeah.
All that gray matter that's doing all this work, whether we're asleep, when we're in creative modes, where all this comes from. I think that's revelatory to me. But I would love to jump on one of the things that we had talked about earlier, before we came on air, is the idea of good leaders telling good stories. And when you were laying that out just now, it occurred to me that, we understand why art is appreciated throughout history and throughout different cultures, like the storyteller, the clown, the kind of societal cultural roles those play. I think we all kind of get that, but I don't know if we understand enough the real connection between good leaders and good stories. I think immediately of politicians, but certainly we can look to corporate America and say, what really separates an effective leader, and what does story have to do with that?
Yeah, and before I do that, just to go back to the we make decisions logically, the thing that happens when we're making these decisions subconsciously based on our long-term memory and this emotional metadata, it is happening subconsciously. The point we become aware of it is when we're applying the logic and rationalization. So it's a little bit like you buy the car because you love the color, but you justify it for the gas mileage. So for all of you that are listening that are like, no, I make rational decisions, like, yes, you do, but it's informed by all of these emotions. And if we're bringing this to great leaders, think about the first time you encounter a leader, whether it's at work or in life in some way, you want to know, like, what is your strategy? What is your background? What you really want to know, what your brain wants to know is like, can I trust this person? Can I understand something about them so that I feel like my confidence in them is okay? So if it's in a company, like, are they going to help my career and job and make sure that all of, I can still be gainfully employed, all of that, that that need, that crave for tell us who you are is part of that. Because when someone does come in a compelling way, can lay out, here's who I am and what I see for us, people can then see, do I trust this person? We
Right.
are really good detectors of someone that doesn't feel genuine or authentic or manipulative. And the moment that that happens, like, that's it. So when
Yep.
someone can come into a team, a company, a moment and share authentically
Yep.
and lay out who they are and what they see and do that through story, it's going to have such a compounding effect for the organization and for people to feel like, okay, this person feels good, that feels right. I can trust them. This is good.
Right. And while you were talking, I mean, God, my mind is totally spinning with all kinds of questions and ideas. But I just popped into my head. I inevitably thought of two people from the 21st century that we associate as very important or very effective leaders who are completely different. But I think of Steve Jobs and what he did with Apple and the story that company told. And just to take one example, but like someone like Donald Trump, leaving politics out of it entirely, I think what both of those, titans of culture were able to do is be very authentic in their own way, but the stories they were telling were inviting people to be part of that story. So I feel like maybe we're getting at some science there where there's this authenticity of sorts, but there's also this kind of like you can become part of this team or part of the story, or is that not a good application of how these things interact?
Well, those two examples are hard because Steve Jobs definitely told great stories, right? Everyone looks to him as such a compelling presenter because he did a couple of things. He laid out things in a very clear, compelling way. It didn't feel overloaded or cluttered. So he was telling a story so people in the audience or viewers could see themselves in these products. They could see how the phone or the iPad or insert whatever would fit into their lives, right? So Steve Jobs told these stories that is selling a product, right? Product marketing, and he did it in a really clear, compelling way. There were other aspects of his leadership that I think were challenging and problematic that you could look at. But for those moments on stage, I think that worked. If you look at Donald Trump, his storytelling is very different. It's about him. right?
Yep.
He centers very much on him and all of the things that he provides and does, which isn't allowing for people to see themselves in it, but people are choosing to hitch themselves to it. It's just a very different style. One is about me, one is about you. Um, and there are definitely trade-offs for different things and what works for people.
Yeah. Um, that makes total sense. I think with Steve Jobs, I was actually, yeah, I definitely his speaking and his stewardship of the company. But I guess I was also talking more about, I mean, the myth story of Apple was, I mean, again, is true factually, historically, but he built a story and a culture around this product. I think that's more what I was trying to invoke is he was a master at making people feel like you're going to buy this, $1,000 product, but you're unique and you're a free thinker, do different. It's like, do different. Doesn't everyone use the same phone? I think there's storytelling genius in someone that can sell something and make the person that's basically following a cultural trend feel like, well, I'm one of the smart ones. Like I'm doing something that no one else does. And I probably should never bring up politics in any conversation, but I mean it more like people that um are able to think, well, I'm not being led, whether it's by the media or by, I mean, effective politicians throughout history have been able to let their fans think, you're not one of the captured ones. I'm telling
Right.
you the truth and you understand the truth. And it's just this wonderful dichotomy of reality versus good storytelling.
Yeah, I think that the Donald Trump one is a little messier and harder to
Yeah,
look at, but the Steve Jobs one, I do think that part of what made him really successful in the way you're describing is he didn't try to pack too much in. So one of the things he did both times he came into Apple or was leading Apple was simplifying products, right? Instead of having so much, it was really, we're going to focus on these things and we're going to do it well. And that was his communication style too. When you simplify a message, which takes a lot of work, much harder to tell a simple message than a complex one, it's very easy for people to follow and then see. And so that played across his communication style and it made it so easy to start to envision these products in your life.
right, right. Well, so how about who is a leader that you talk about that you say, that exemplifies, the best aspects of storytelling and leadership and it has combined, what we all should aspire to if we want to lead or tell good stories. Is there an individual in any of these different fields that stands out as like the epitome?
There are. I prefer to look at what they're doing than a specific person because I find these are things that anybody can do versus trying to emulate someone. I
Right.
saw a CEO of a big Fortune 500 company send these messages out every 2, 3 weeks, an email that fit within the frame, the window frame, so you didn't have to scroll, that was telling stories of different client interactions and what they experienced in a lesson that was a takeaway from it. And these were just takeaways.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing happened. Like one was just shared, came out of a meeting, thought it was really interesting, wrote it, sent it out. But the response was huge because then teams within the company were talking about it and it had other people start to tell stories and it created this whole engine of learning and really a learning culture. And then he started sending these every 2, 3 weeks and it created this whole ripple down effect that was huge and a big culture shaper. So little things like that can make a big difference in stories. It doesn't have to be the big moment in a presentation or like Steve Jobs did. It can be sharing lessons learned. It can be these moments in coaching sessions where someone says exactly what you need to hear. It's finding the different opportunities to connect and share through story in big and small moments.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Thank you for that. I think we've already talked a little bit about what we, and I always have to do this like timeless, like that we could unpackage that for hours. Like what is a timeless story or what makes a story timeless? But understanding that the timelessness of a story, one of the ways we identify that is it resonates not in a specific time period, but when we drill down, and I'm imagining when you work with clients, when you're giving talks and presentations, and people want to know, how do I tell my story? I imagine you home in on what is your story to tell, and how do you help people identify, you know, when it maybe doesn't make sense to try to be universal, to you can be universal by being yourself. Um, Maybe talk a little bit about how you help people figure out what the right story for them to tell is.
We always start with the audience. So storytelling doesn't start with the idea or the message. It always starts with the audience. And what do you want them to think or feel internally? What do you want them to experience? And then what do you want them to know or do as a result of the story? What's their mindset today? And what might be an obstacle in getting them to what you want them to know, think, feel, do? Because if you center on that, even if you know the story you're going to tell it differently each time based on who you're talking to. So you always want to start by getting really clear on that audience because that's how you're going to figure out what exactly is the right message and how do we make it relevant for this group and how do we make it timeless? How do we put in the examples that are really going to resonate and connect with them? And so anytime I'm working with people, that's where we start. Who are we connecting with? Why are you connecting? What are you trying to do? What are all the mental protests that you have to work through to get there? Because that can also play a big role in how you develop your stories. That's the biggest place we start. Once we know that and we know what we want the audience to experience, then you can step back and say, okay, now let's mine your professional life, your personal life experiences from around the world, things that you love, music and podcasts and museums and whatever, and ask yourself which one of these examples, which one of these things can you use to tell a story that will help achieve what you want as an outcome. It is a way of working back into finding the right idea for the audience, but you have to know who that audience is and what you want them to experience first.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that so often when we talk about storytelling, there's the assumption that it's for creative people or it's a creative act. I think it is a creative act any way you slice it. There's creativity involved. To me, what that means is hammering home that everyone has creativity in them, whether they consider themselves creative or even the idea of creativity appeals to them. But I love also we keep coming back to these tensions, the tension of artifice, like telling a good story, a good yarn, versus a story that is meant to be true to life, no hidden symbols. And there's similar things operating on both. Do you find that it's harder to get to coach people or to explain how to untap kind of that creative impulse, or just telling stories, in a corporate or business setting with a very specific goal? And what are the pros cons in terms of trying to help people figure that out?
I don't think it's different. What I try to do is guide people through the process of what do you want to consider when you're telling a story. And that works whether it's a presentation, a eulogy, a creative endeavor. It's going step by step because your average person isn't going to sit down and get a story out in one pass and have it be perfect. So instead, it's breaking it into let's get clear on the audience. Let's figure out what the right story is to tell. Let's structure it so that it's got a solid bone skeleton to it. And now let's start to add in all the things that the brain's going to pay attention to. And now that you've got that, let's play with what is the right order to tell this? What makes it have the most tension, the most creativity? How do you make sure everything is earning its place and moving the story forward or helping us learn something about characters? And so it's like you keep working through the steps to get there, and it varies based on the audience and the format, but who's going through it, it doesn't make a difference. The steps are the same. The considerations and outputs are where the differences come in.
That makes so much sense. It also occurs to me, like those of us in the more creative spaces, certainly the academic spaces, I think by the time creativity comes into the equation, the audience is coming to a class or coming to a workshop. So there's already been the invitation of, I want to harness creativity to tell some kind of story. So I'd love to hear a little more about the non-creative or the more corporate dash professional. What are some of the barriers you're finding that always have to be overcome when people either have to understand everyone can tell a story, everything is story? Are there some kind of classic, typical obstacles to overcome to get people to unlock that flow?
I have a story that covers both the creative and the business and the obstacles. And
Good.
it is an example from State Street Global Advisors. In 2017, they're launching a mutual fund under the ticker SHE on International Women's Day. And it was meant to be a splash that brought attention to women in leadership on Wall Street. There traditionally have not been very many women in senior leadership roles. So State Street was like, you know what? We're going to do this. It's going to be International Women's Day. We're going to do this big launch. We're going to figure out what to do to bring attention to this. And they brought in creative teams and they planned and they thought, like, if you think of Wall Street, you often think of the big bronze bull. And they thought that's kind of masculine energy.
Right.
What if we came up with something that represented feminine energy and installed it opposite the bull? And that would kind of bring this all full circle. So the creative teams and State Street Global Advisor spent months working on this. And they finally were like, we've got it. They went to the city of New York and they filed a permit for the Wall Street cow. Their thought for what would be great feminine energy would be to install a cow opposite a bull. And they were so many months down. They were a few months away from actually casting the bronze cow, right? Permits in hand, the name is there. And they were so far down this path that you can imagine how uncomfortable it was in the conference room that day when someone was like, maybe, hear me out, maybe installing a cow is not the best symbol of feminine energy. But they got so caught up in this creative idea, and we're going to do this installation. It's going to be like the bull, that they stopped to forget who is their audience and why are they trying to do this. And this happens all the time. We get so caught up in ideas and don't really step back and think about the audience and what we're trying to do. They did fortunately catch it, and they ended up pivoting to the fearless girl, who is
Yes.
this 4 feet tall sculpture that is her ponytail swings and her skirt swooshes. And she was installed initially for a week opposite the bull, meant to represent the feminine energy. And she's kind of defiantly staring down the bull, lines wrapped around the block. People waited an hour to see her, and that 1 week became a month and a year, to the point where the artist that designed the bull said, "You've got to get her out of here because now she's making the bull look like a bully," which is funny in itself. And so she is
Sure.
now permanently installed across from Wall Street.
Amazing.
And she almost wasn't. She's had, I don't even know how many billion impressions, maybe even trillion impressions on social media at this point. And her initial story doesn't even matter anymore because now she takes on the story of the people that stand alongside her and what she means to them. And that's what a great story does. It
Right.
gives enough space so that people take it on and it means something to them. And that may be different person to person, but it almost started off so tragically wrong. And so when you neglect your audience and what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, you're going to get your stories wrong. And so many people, creative and in business, jump in with, I've got the story, I know what we need to do, instead of, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? That's one of the biggest mistakes people make. And so that's one that's always like, this works very well in the business world. Like, let's just tactically pause and get clear on what we're doing and why we're doing it before we get too far down the path.
Yeah. That is unbelievable. That is well, it's a great story.
Can you imagine if they had actually installed the cow? Like, you just think that would be so embarrassing and awkward for them. It's not relevant. And now the pivot, there's replicas of the fearless girl all around the world. And, everybody wants to go take their photo next to her.
Yeah, and I think that brings up, another great question because I think it's so relevant to the 21st century and I think it's been exploited and not really fully kind of understood as it relates to everything from DEI to woke, but this notion of authenticity and who gets to tell the story. And it's not really a question so much as I'd love any thoughts you have, not to dive into any of like the third rail politics, but my principle has always been anyone can tell any story. Like, you can tell a story. You can use your imagination to imagine an experience very different than yours. But I think being, responsible and in thinking about audience, whether you're doing, especially if you're doing fiction, because with professional, it's kind of understood. You're trying to sell something. You're trying to engineer a decision-making process. But with creativity, I think there is that fine line between writing what you want to write, which I think most teachers would say, of course you can do that. But being aware in advance, that might not land the way you intend it to, and be cognizant of, could this story be better told by someone else, and or could I tell a more authentic story or a more creative story? Again, I apologize. I'm not really asking you a question so much as I love that very complex area between how we view authenticity, how we appreciate and stimulate creativity, but your emphasis on thinking about audience first is so relevant because I think, especially in the creative endeavors, a lot of writers and teachers will say, you shouldn't worry about the audience. Like, you've got to write your true story no matter what. But then people wonder why it isn't selling. So there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, um, I can understand that thought of you have to write what you want in fiction. I think that there's the story you write and there's the story people experience. And so I went through this, right? When I published the book, I remember putting a post up of, in the week leading up to it of, for the past year, whatever, in the publishing journey, this has been my book, but it's about to become our book because it no longer matters once it publishes what I
Sure.
wanted. It's what people take from it and experience and what that is for them. And that's very true in fiction too. Your story, fact or fiction, will not be for everyone. You are not for everyone, nor should you try to be. So understanding who your audience is and what you want them to experience is important. And in certain cases, I do think it's important to consider, am I the right one to tell this story, or is it more appropriate from someone else? Or why am I sharing this?
Right, right. Well, and that brings up another thing that I know you've spoken and written extensively about, and it's this, I think, another cultural assumption that, and it's true, right? In social settings, our favorite storytellers tend to be the gregarious extroverts. But the reality is, I think, whether it's in advertising or the creative fields, very often it's the people who are deeply uncomfortable speaking in public or interacting in a social setting that are the most effective and best storytellers. Talk a little bit about, the introvert versus extrovert, and why I imagine you're often kind of encouraging or reminding people introverts can and do tell stories as well.
Yeah, a couple of points on this. So part of the work I do is I'm a keynote speaker. I get on stage in front of thousands of people at a time to share ideas on storytelling. And um, more than 50% of keynote speakers are introverts, which sounds really weird. Like I've been on stage in front of over 10,000 people at a time, and that sounds like something of an introvert would never do. But 90% of speaking, creating, writing is very introverted. It is thinking about what am I trying to convey to this group and how do I want to do that? And it's a very solo, introverted, energy restorative activity. 10% of it is the extroverted on stage, how you're communicating it. I am introverted, and so I love that. I don't get depleted by it because it's finishing the tail of this process, but the majority of the process is very introverted. In life, introverts can be fantastic storytellers because there's research that says extroverts speak more words per day, introverts are more measured in what they say. And because there is a word economy, they can have much more impact by sharing a story when they communicate than just speaking. It's going to last longer and have ripple effects. So, that alone makes the greatest impact of the words they're sharing. But also because introverts often aren't the first to speak or they're not speaking as much, they're doing a lot of observing and they're noticing details and patterns and questions and things that others might not see. So when you're taking that in and noticing and using that as part of what you speak up as, it's completely changing the energy, the discussion, and bringing attention to things that are very much needed. Speaking and storytelling is not extroverted. It is how you are packaging information to build an understanding or connect with people. And introverts are so well suited for that.
That immediately, Karen, makes me think of another kind of very interesting and very thorny issue that I'm seeing play out on a daily basis, which is it's a total stereotype, it's a total generalization, but it's also true-ish to say that in the previous century, writers and creators could be more solitary, more private. They put their work into the world. It became other people's stories, as you eloquently, underscore, like ceases to be your own work once it's received. But nowadays, any type of writer, I think in the creative fields, especially, it's incumbent upon in a very crowded and consolidating market space, everyone is brand building and everyone has to be playing with the available tools. So, however reluctantly, it doesn't mean someone has to suddenly become this extroverted presence, but being active on social media, having a website, kind of maintaining a presence. A lot of writers have gone into that kicking and screaming. Talk about
Yeah.
your experience with that and how you help people navigate that.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing when so much of writing often is an introverted, introspective, at least, activity. And then if you're trying to publish this or share it on a larger scale, you're now shouting into a stadium that's very noisy, and that's really hard. And the rules of social media change daily, and so it's hard to get attention.
Yeah.
But if I frame it as books, just as a packaged form of publishing or putting things out there, there's two ways that people find books because you talk about it or because someone else talks about it. And so, where you're looking for pockets to get in front of people in different ways, that is what's going to get attention. The the mistake I think people make is they just keep trying to push the same message over and over. But what gets people's attention is where you share your creative process and behind the scenes and what have you done and what was interesting and where did you struggle. And, there's a reason why these posts where people share their cover art or they ask you to vote on that or vote on their author
Yep.
photo or some type of thing get the most views because people love being brought into that. So it's not just this one note, let me tell you all about this story or what I'm trying to do. It's a combination of being human and letting them connect with you and understand what you did behind it. It's finding different ways to get in front of people, even in small groups, that others are talking about it and they are spreading the word and that you're consistently showing up. The research is something like it takes 7 times for people to see a message on social media.
Right.
I think I have people that are regularly reading my newsletter that 2 years later said, "You have a book?" And I'm like, "It's in every issue, really?" But
Wow.
people are busy. Nobody's paying
Yeah.
attention to you as much as they want. And so you just have to consistently find different ways to bring it in front of them and bring different angles to it. And while the world can be a cruel, hard place, people are also very kind and supportive when you are sharing, like, here's a goal of mine or a life mission or something I've been doing.
Right.
People are generally celebratory. And so every post can't be that. But when you can find
Right.
those things to maximize and get attention, that makes a big difference. There's a reason why Book Talk took off because people were getting really creative and some of them were taking their stories and telling them as though it was like a real story that happened to a friend. And then you get hooked and then you're like, oh my gosh, that's a book. Let me get it. It's different ways to put those teasers in front of people that are sometimes visual, sometimes video based that can make a difference as well.
That's so helpful. That's so that makes so much sense. I think what I thought of while you were describing that, we've talked about a lot about authenticity and how much of what we're discussing is infused with either that as an aspiration or just an inherent part of the process that makes it effective. But we're also talking about vulnerability.
Yeah. It's so
Um,
vulnerable because whether you're in a business meeting telling a story or whether you're putting out your creative work, it's a personal form of expression and it's a different type of communication, one that not everybody else is doing, and that feels vulnerable. And we are often in an age and place where people then want to share their opinions back or dialogue about it, and that is vulnerable.
yes.
And that is hard. You asked me, how do you work with people when there are these objections and obstacles? I face this all the time with leaders where they are hesitant to tell a story or it feels really vulnerable. And so we always try to find some small way for them to tell a story because the benefit of being vulnerable is you see what you get back in return. you see how people come and share stories and how they're real with you and they comment, and you feel so rewarded for this risk, what felt risky that you've taken. And so once they see that, it's like, okay, I can do it. It's a little bit like you're trying to work up the nerve to ride the roller coaster, and then you go on it, you finish, and you're like, let's go again, because now you're so excited. Same thing, just find different ways to try it. Because once people do experience the vulnerable, authentic you, they will mirror that back. And that is such a gift.
It's a total gift, and I still think, what's perplexing about that is it's sort of like catching lightning in a bottle. Like we don't know whether it's a story, like a short story or a poem or an ad campaign, etc., presentation, how it's going to land or how the audience is going to receive it. It could be a variety of factors influencing that. But I think, again, being really immersed in the creative industries, I see all the time, and I know it's always been this way. There's always been the how-to books. Those are, they can be a dime a dozen in terms of if you just do this,
Yeah.
this will happen. I think most of us grow to understand that it's not that way. It shouldn't be that way.
No.
But it is so challenging for people. Just what you were just talking about, it made so much sense to me. But I was thinking like how to apply that on a case-to-case basis. And the reality is, I do think people are taught it takes 7 times. So keep posting, keep hammering it home. That can turn people off. The vulnerability can become TMI. Like it's so challenging to find the right kind of cadence with how you present your authentic self, but also do it in an effective way. I certainly have never mastered it.
But I also think go back to your motivation. So I have this TED Talk that has over 2 million views, which is amazing. It did not start there. It was a TEDx that struggled to get 10,000 views. TED saw it, and there's a whole jury process. They put it through their process and decided we want to put this on TED.com. Same exact talk, hit 1 million views in a day. It just was happenstance and luck.
Yeah,
But I get a lot of people, I do work with a lot of people that are doing these big presentations, these talks, these things, and they want to have the big, amazing outcome.
right.
And I always encourage people like, you don't do a TED Talk because you think you're going to get 1 million views. You do a TED Talk because you have an idea you want to share, and you have to be okay. You have to ask yourself with, am I okay doing this if I get 1,000 views? Am I okay creating this creative work if
Yeah.
it doesn't go viral and doesn't have the whatever? Because if you can get clear on that and it's a yes, then the rest is amazing. It's great. Unfortunately, we love to compare and we look across social media and we see all these things that seem so easy. And there's 100 million reasons why so many of those things happen the way they do that you can't always replicate. The how-to books can't have you follow that exact same formula and get the same outcome. And so it has to come back to why are you doing this and putting it out there? And can
Yeah.
you be comfortable with you're doing this if it goes nowhere, but it's important to you to put it out there into the world. Now, I know it's not quite that easy because we're doing this for a living and you have to have results and you have to be able to get to stuff, but I think going into things expecting it to be this viral thing is just an unhelpful step. It sets us up for different expectations.
I couldn't agree more, and I really think that ties so many threads, both in this conversation and the work that we both do, but also just kind of historically as we tackle these issues. And it is like why I referenced the kind of cynical how-to books. The reality is there isn't a formula. If it was, anyone can do it. But I
Yeah.
also think, and you won't be surprised to hear, they come in roundabout fashion. But almost everybody I talk to, when we dive deep into story, it comes back to this fundamental impulse. If you're doing it for clicks, if you're doing it to make money, if you're doing it because you're chasing a trend, it could work, and maybe you're going to be successful. But I think fundamentally, and younger writers hate to hear this, but there has to be some internal satisfaction, it has to be coming from a genuine place, or else
You burn
that's why
out.
so many writers don't make it, because it
Yeah.
usually does involve so much rejection, so
Yeah.
much solitude and alone time, that if the work itself is not scratching some kind of philosophical or fundamental itches, it's probably not going to sustain you over the long haul. So yeah,
No, you'll,
trying to get the million views, that's usually the result of a lot of work that's gone in as opposed to the immediate effect. But you
yeah.
articulated it so wonderfully.
But you'll burn out if you're chasing something that is elusive. Now, that said, 100% of what you do doesn't have to be because you have this burning desire. It's okay to experiment and try some things and see what do
Yeah.
people respond to. I do that a lot. I try to notice when I'm posting on different social media or when I'm interacting, what is it that people are responding to? What type of story are people responding to? And so I give myself a percentage that I'll play with and be like, okay, yeah, I'm comfortable with like 20% at the moment. And that'll change depending on different things. I'll dial it up and dial it down. But at the core of it, you have to have more bad days than, or more good days than bad, right? You have to be feeling like you're comfortable doing what you're doing and you know why you're doing it and you're not feeling depleted. And so if you're just chasing views and likes and responses, you're gonna go really negative in that quickly, and that isn't sustainable.
Yep. Yep. Here's a I think I love the question I'm about to ask, but it might be a tricky one for you. Having written a book and done an amazingly successful TED Talk, anything you care to say about those things is welcome. But my question would be, what have you learned about yourself and story after the book and the TED Talk based on the feedback you've gotten? What interesting insights have you gained that you might not even have realized before you did either of those things?
After the TED Talk published, it was very overwhelming. It doesn't
Okay.
seem like it would be, but hitting
Yeah.
1 million views so quickly, then had very many people all over the world reaching out, often reaching out with, I really have to tell my story and you're the one that can help, or we're struggling with this, or can I please share my very emotional story? And so that I was unprepared for. I did not expect that,
Mhm.
and having to learn how to navigate that and where I can give energy and attention and where I can't. But in
Yeah.
that was the recognition that when your story resonates, one of the signs, like, how do I know my story is working? It's the I see your story and I raise you a story. It's when people tell you stories in return. And that is the thing I've paid so much attention to, of what I get back in response, or where there's questions or where people are sharing stories. That's when I know you've really hit something, because in business, especially, leaders are often reticent to tell a personal story or personal details. And every story is personal. Even if you're not sharing a story about yourself, there's a reason why you're the one telling it. And the
Right.
details that you're bringing to it, you're going to tell it in a way that's different from someone else. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's private. It doesn't mean that you're sharing your innermost secrets. Like in my TED Talk, I tell stories about other people, but I make them personal because of how I tell it. And recognizing that the more personal you can make a story, how you can put in specific details and stuff, the more it helps the audience picture their own version. And that triggers a story in return. And so those two, that really has been the thing that was like, oh, I didn't expect this outpouring. And now it's a gift to get messages every week from people that are connecting with stuff. And I see, based on the stories they share back, what resonates.
So, with these experiences and the momentum building, where are you focusing? Is there another book? Is there another TED Talk? Are you completely sated by the amount of work you have now? I'm curious, especially, I do think we're hearing more about story, or I feel like outside of the academy, culturally, we're at least beginning to understand how story operates, or there's a respect for the need to tell good stories or better stories. Either or both, hopefully. What are you working on? And how do you feel maybe just in America, the state of story is, and what can we do to either improve it or help improve it?
It's a really interesting moment for stories because you have AI increasing the dialogue and conversation, and there's a lot of fears of it'll ruin the creative realms. I don't agree. I think that stories are authentic and a creative expression of an individual. And when we feel that, that feels really genuine. And that's where all of that neuroscience comes in. We feel the empathy, the oxytocin, all of that.
Yeah.
AI will remove some of the repetitive things, and it may play a role in some stories and writing copy for the back of shampoo bottles and stuff. But as humans, as long as humans roam the earth, we are going to have a need to be able to connect with one another and to do that in a creative way that engages the brain. And stories are going to play such a big role in that. And that is something that if you learn the skill, you will always have as a strength in your life and in your work. In the moment we're in, what's challenging about that is that it requires people to listen. Um, you need someone to consume the story, otherwise we're all just talking at people, which is what happens a lot. And so I think that's the challenge, I think, on the size and scale that we're doing stuff. But if you are connecting with someone maybe that has opposing beliefs and you sit down individually, you find that you have so much more in common than you realize, and you start to share your different perspectives. And while you won't necessarily agree on things, you do come away seeing them different. And so I have hope that we can do more at that level and hopefully a little less on the shouting side. As for me, I have a lot of writing that I do. I have a blog called Brain Food where I'm sharing all these different ideas on stories, and I look for those questions and reactions and things that are reflected back to me, and I write about them and continue to help people there. I work within companies to do storytelling workshops and work with leaders on stories and help prepare people for TEDx to ingrain these skills so people get better at them. I'm doing a lot on storytelling with data. How are you bringing meaning to it? How do you navigate that? And a big part of my job is keynotes and connecting with different audiences. And so all of that continues. There's not a writing being formulated into a book, but I have probably published 4 different books in terms of my blog and insights and stuff on there. So there's plenty of resources to dig into.
That's so great. I was kind of, yeah, it was a very maybe not so subtle leading question. I wanted to, and we'll, of course, we'll put links to the TED Talk and how to find you and discover you. But I think a good note to end on is we didn't even say it, and it comes up a lot in my conversations, but what you just tied it in a neat little bow is the other thing we've talked about: vulnerability, empathy, creativity, but this notion of community. And clearly, what you're talking about is identifying communities, addressing effectively communities, but also it's very underlooked curating community, building community. And you obviously are an expert at that, but clearly, your TED Talk and your book have enabled you, and then your blog are you are nurturing the community or the communities that you're building. That's hard work, but I have to imagine that's the most gratifying part.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not doing it for viral. I'm doing it because I know who I'm talking to and what I want to share with them. And that feels really good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Karen, as expected, I learned a lot. I know the people that watch this podcast are going to learn a lot, but I think the best service I can do, besides giving you a modest platform, is helping people discover your TED Talk, your blog, the stuff you do that can help guide them. Because my ultimate feeling is, whether we agree, whether it's AI or politics or any number, there's a lot of bad stories or there's a lot of fake stories. And my mantra kind of has been, we need to tell better stories, and the better stories will overwhelm the things that are cynical or disingenuous or fake. And so I salute you for doing so much work in helping elevate the understanding of story and in helping equip people with the ability to tell better stories, because I think above everything else and all other considerations, culturally, we need that so badly right now.
Yeah, I agree. The more compelling, vulnerable, authentic things will rise up and people will be drawn to that. You can't fake it, and people can detect when it feels manipulative or disingenuous. So put your energy towards the good stories.
Well, Karen, thanks again for the work you do. Thanks for being here today. And you've hopefully have created a bunch of new fans, and we'll look forward to checking in with you and seeing, where we both are as our adventures, the story continue. But I wish you all the best and look forward to following the amazing stuff that you're doing.
Love it. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.